Africa is poised to rule the world.
Reports began circulating that President Duma Boko declined a White House invitation and insisted that any high-level talks should take place in Botswana. There has been no official confirmation from either side, but that detail almost feels secondary to the reaction the story triggered across African platforms. Why did it resonate so instantly? Why did it feel less like gossip and more like a shift in posture? Why does the physical location of diplomacy suddenly carry psychological weight? This isn't really about one invitation. It's about power, perception, and a continent recalibrating its sense of position in the world. And if Africa is adjusting its diplomatic geometry, the real question becomes, what changed? Let's find out. It was never about the invitation itself. It was about the stage. In global politics, location is not logistics, it is language. Where a meeting happens silently answers questions before a single word is spoken. Who traveled? Who hosted? Whose flags framed the backdrop? Whose media asked the first question? These details seem minor until you understand that diplomacy is theater layered over strategy. For decades, the choreography has followed a predictable direction. African leaders are boarding planes to Western capitals. Photographs on polished steps. Joint statements delivered under ceilings built long before African independence. The symbolism became routine, almost invisible. But invisibility does not mean neutrality. The setting communicates hierarchy even when the dialogue claims equality. Psychologists call it environmental priming. The space you occupy influences how you perceive yourself and how others perceive you. A guest in someone else's house behaves differently from a host receiving visitors. That is not insecurity. It is human instinct. So when the idea spread that an African president might insist talks happen at home, it struck deeper than protocol. It disrupted muscle memory. Botswana is not a revolutionary state known for dramatic diplomatic gestures. It is methodical, stable, careful with its words, and even more careful with its economic planning. Diamonds built its fiscal backbone, but governance preserved it. This matters because when a country known for moderation signals spatial confidence, it does not read as recklessness. It reads as recalibration. Think about the psychology of hosting. When discussions occur on your soil, your institutions frame the environment. Your press leads the narrative. Your citizens observe the exchange through a domestic lens, not through foreign commentary. Agenda setting shifts subtly, even timing shifts. There is less rush to accommodate another capital's clock. This is not hostility toward the West. It is structural normalization. Europe hosts summits on its soil without apology. China convenes leaders in Beijing. The United States negotiates from Washington as the default. Why should African capitals not do the same as a matter of routine parity? Frantz Fanon wrote that colonial structures persist not only in economics but in the mind. Posture is part of that inheritance. When posture changes, perception follows, and perception influences policy. But here is the tension. Symbolism alone does not equal power. A meeting in Gaborone changes optics, but does it change outcomes? Does altering geography alter leverage? Or does it simply satisfy psychological hunger without shifting material terms? If Africa is adjusting where it stands, the next question is whether it also controls what it holds. Does changing the venue change the outcome? Not by itself. But the venue reflects leverage. And leverage is not emotional. It is mathematical. Africa's position in the global system has evolved quietly over the past 2 decades. Not through dramatic declarations, but through structural shifts in supply chains, demographics, and geopolitical competition. Start with resources. The global energy transition depends on materials that sit beneath African soil. Cobalt, manganese, platinum group metals, and rare earth elements are not decorative exports. They are foundational to electric vehicles, renewable energy storage, aerospace systems, and advanced electronics. The Green Revolution celebrated in Western capitals is materially tied to African geology. That is not ideological rhetoric. It is an industrial dependency. Now layer demographics on top. Africa is the youngest continent on Earth. By mid-century, Its working-age population will exceed that of China and India combined. Youth is not just a statistic, it is labor force expansion, consumer growth, and political energy. Markets follow population gravity. Then consider geopolitical competition. The United States, China, the European Union, India, Turkey, and Gulf states are all deepening engagement across the continent. The infrastructure finance, military cooperation, digital investments, and agricultural partnerships field is crowded. Crowded fields create bargaining space. In a unipolar world, dependency flows in one direction. In a competitive world, negotiations become auctions of influence. This is where posture connects to leverage. If options exist, confidence follows. If confidence follows, negotiation tone changes. Botswana sits within this wider context. It is not acting in isolation from continental momentum. Its long-term diamond management strategy showed early awareness of resource leverage. Rather than exhausting mineral wealth recklessly, it used revenue to stabilize its macroeconomic framework. That stability grants diplomatic patience. Patience is power. When a state is not desperate, it negotiates differently. It does not rush to secure validation. It evaluates offers. It sets conditions. It calculates trade-offs. This is why the idea of insisting on talks within Botswana resonates logically, not as rebellion, as an equilibrium. But leverage can be misused. History shows resource-rich nations trapped by corruption, elite capture, or poor institutional planning. Minerals alone do not guarantee sovereignty. They can amplify weakness as easily as strength. So the real issue is not whether Africa has leverage. It clearly does. The question is whether institutions across the continent are mature enough to translate that leverage into sustained development rather than short-term optics. And if institutions determine outcomes, what reforms must accompany this new diplomatic posture to prevent history from repeating itself? What reforms must accompany confidence so that it does not dissolve into symbolism? Institutions, not speeches, not headlines, not viral moments. Institutions determine whether leverage turns into transformation or evaporates into nostalgia. Africa's history offers both warnings and models. After independence, many states inherited administrative systems designed for extraction rather than development. Colonial bureaucracies were efficient at moving resources outward, not at building domestic industry inward. When political sovereignty arrived, economic architecture often remained externally oriented. That misalignment produced vulnerability. But the story did not freeze there. Botswana, for example, invested heavily in fiscal prudence. It built one of Africa's strongest sovereign wealth frameworks through careful diamond revenue management. It maintained relatively low debt ratios and avoided the hyperinflation traps that destabilized others. That did not happen by accident. It required technocratic discipline and long-term planning. This is the difference between possession and control. Possession is having minerals beneath your soil. Control is structuring contracts, taxation regimes, and reinvestment policies that compound value over decades. The same principle applies to diplomacy. If talks occur on African soil but agreements replicate asymmetrical terms, the venue is cosmetic. If agreements prioritize local processing, technology transfer, infrastructure development, and workforce training, then geography becomes part of a larger strategic shift. Institutional maturity means negotiating clauses that protect national interests beyond election cycles. It means transparent procurement processes. It means anti-corruption mechanisms that function even when politically inconvenient. Young Africans increasingly understand this tension. They celebrate symbolic moments, but they also scrutinize outcomes. Social media amplifies applause quickly, but it also exposes policy failure just as fast. This is where governance becomes the silent battlefield. Countries that convert mineral exports into industrial capacity change their trajectory. Countries that rely solely on commodity extraction remain price takers in global markets. Diplomatic posture must align with the economic blueprint. Political theorist Samuel Huntington once argued that political order depends on institutionalization, the process by which organizations become stable, valued, and resilient. Without institutional depth, rapid political shifts create instability. With institutional depth, they create continuity. If Africa's diplomatic geometry is shifting, institutional architecture must shift with it. But institutional reform does not occur in isolation. External actors respond to internal change. Global powers adjust when negotiation environments evolve. So if African states strengthen governance while asserting new diplomatic confidence, how will Western governments recalibrate their own strategies in response? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. How will Western governments recalibrate if African states negotiate with stronger institutions and firmer postures? Not with outrage, with adaptation. Global powers do not operate on wounded pride. They operate on strategic interest. If African governments demonstrate institutional coherence, fiscal discipline, and unified bargaining positions, Western capitals will not withdraw. They will compete more carefully. The West's engagement with Africa has always contained layers: security cooperation in the Sahel, trade agreements under preferential frameworks, development finance through multilateral banks, climate partnerships tied to energy transition. These are not acts of charity. They are strategic alignments shaped by energy needs, migration flows, counterinsurgency priorities, and supply chain security. When Africa negotiates from weakness, Western terms dominate the structure. When Africa negotiates from a position of strength, Western terms soften. This is already visible in subtle shifts. The European Union's Global Gateway Initiative seeks infrastructure partnerships that respond to China's Belt and Road presence. The United States frames new mineral security partnerships as mutual resilience rather than extraction. Language evolves when leverage is recognized. Competition modifies tone. If Botswana, or any African state, insists on hosting high-level talks while presenting clear institutional roadmaps, Western diplomats adjust to that clarity. They cannot ignore access to strategic resources. They cannot ignore demographic markets. They cannot ignore regional stability interests. But adjustment does not mean surrender. It means recalculation. Western states will seek long-term agreements that secure supply chains while minimizing political unpredictability. They will favor partners with predictable governance structures. They will prioritize legal frameworks that protect foreign investment. That is rational behavior. The tension emerges when African governments push for value addition within their borders. Processing minerals domestically reduces raw export margins for foreign firms. Technology transfer clauses increase bargaining friction. Local content requirements reshape corporate profit calculations. This is where negotiation becomes delicate. Africa's strength lies not in rejection, but in strategic clarity. Hostility wastes leverage. Precision maximizes it. If the continent presents itself as disciplined, reform-driven, and economically coordinated, Western engagement will continue, but on more balanced terrain. However, balance depends on unity. Fragmented negotiation weakens even strong individual states. Regional coordination strengthens bargaining weight.
Its distinct histories with the colonial legacy, with the 55 national entities, either to unify or not to unify. And to my mind, that's the single most important thing that's needed is African unity.
So the next question is larger than Botswana or any single leader. Can African states align their economic strategies across borders strongly enough to transform individual leverage into continental influence? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Only if coordination replaces fragmentation. Africa's greatest vulnerability has never been a lack of resources. It has been divided into negotiation. When states bargain separately, external powers optimize terms country by country. When states align, leverage compounds. This is why regional integration matters more than symbolic moments. The African Continental Free Trade Area is not just a trade agreement. It is an attempt to reduce dependency on external markets by strengthening intra-African commerce. If implemented effectively, it allows countries to industrialize through regional supply chains rather than exporting raw materials outward and importing finished goods back at a higher cost. Industrialization thrives in scale. Scale requires markets. Markets require integration. Imagine mineral-rich states coordinating export policies so that processing hubs emerge within the continent. Imagine energy corridors designed to support manufacturing clusters across borders. Imagine digital payment systems that reduce transaction friction across African economies. This is not utopian, it is strategic sequencing. When negotiations with global powers occur from a unified continental framework, the tone changes dramatically. Instead of 54 separate bargaining tables, there is structured coordination. That does not erase national sovereignty, it amplifies it. Europe understood this after World War II. Fragmented states created vulnerability. Integration produced collective weight. Africa's path is different, but the principle remains. Unity multiplies leverage. Botswana's insistence on hosting talks would signal confidence. But Botswana operating within a coordinated African strategy would signal strength. There are challenges. Political systems differ. Economic capacities vary. Infrastructure gaps remain significant. Trust between governments fluctuates. Integration requires compromise, and compromise demands leadership that thinks beyond electoral cycles. Yet the alternative is predictable. Continued competition among neighbors for external favor, which weakens long-term bargaining power. Gen Z across the continent increasingly sees this pattern. They are less interested in ideological alignment and more interested in functional outcomes. Jobs, technology, manufacturing, food security, digital autonomy. These are continental questions, not isolated national ones. Diplomatic posture must therefore align with regional ambition. If Africa hosts negotiations at home but negotiates alone, it wins small gains. If it coordinates regionally, it alters global equations. But unity requires more than economic agreements. It requires a psychological shift, a belief that Africa is not a collection of negotiating units, but a shared strategic space. So the final question becomes deeper than venue or leverage. Is Africa ready to think as a bloc in a world that still approaches it as fragments? That question is not economic. It is psychological. Every structural shift begins in the mind before it appears in policy. The most significant revolutions in history were not triggered by weapons or treaties first. They were triggered by altered self-perception. When a person stops seeing themselves through the lens of dependency, their behavior changes. When its behavior changes, the system around it adjusts. The circulating news about President Duma Boko did not ignite a reaction because of procedural diplomacy. It ignited a reaction because it symbolized something internal, the refusal to instinctively center validation elsewhere. For generations, success in African politics was often measured by proximity to Western institutions. A meeting in Washington signaled prestige. Approval from Paris suggested legitimacy. Endorsement from multilateral lenders implied stability. That psychological framework shaped policy choices. But something is shifting. African youth today consume information differently. They compare development models. They study global power transitions. They watch how Asia industrialized, how Gulf states leveraged resources, and how Latin America navigated debt cycles. They are not romantics. They are observers of patterns. The question they are asking is simple. Why must Africa negotiate from inherited scripts? This does not require hostility toward the West. It requires internal recalibration. Western states pursue their interests rationally. So should African states. A psychological break does not mean burning bridges. It means walking across them without lowering your head. If African leaders approach diplomacy with clarity of leverage, institutional discipline, and regional coordination, the geography of meetings becomes symbolic of a deeper reality. It reflects a continent aware of its strategic weight. And awareness changes tone. When tone changes, concessions follow. When concessions follow, structures evolve. But psychological shifts must guard against arrogance. Confidence without preparation collapses. Bold posture without institutional strength invites instability. The objective is not dramatic confrontation. It is quiet repositioning. Africa's transformation will not be announced in one headline. It will be visible in incremental decisions, where negotiations occur, how contracts are structured, how regional policies align, and how youth are integrated into economic planning. The rumor of one declined invitation matters less than the reaction it provoked, because reactions reveal readiness. If a generation is prepared to question inherited hierarchies, if governments are prepared to strengthen institutions, if regional blocs are prepared to coordinate strategy, then the meeting room, wherever it stands, becomes secondary. The deeper shift is this: Africa is beginning to see itself not as a peripheral player in global politics, but as a central stakeholder in the next phase of the international order. And when a continent changes how it sees itself, the world eventually adjusts. The real turning point will not be where the next meeting happens. It will be when Africa no longer measures its importance by where it is invited, but by what it can demand. Let us know in the comments section. Is Africa changing? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.